The Restoration Age, 1660 to 1700. Restoration describes this period in the history of English literature when the monarchy was reinstated in England and Charles II, who had been exiled in France after his father's defeat by Oliver Cromwell's parliamentary forces, returned to England and assumed the throne. All restrictions and rules were abandoned with his arrival, and a swell of licentiousness and frivolity swept the nation. The poets were instructed to adopt the manner of their French colleagues and to forsake the poetry that had previously existed. They started copying the vices of French writers. As a result, the Elizabethan spirit and passion for knowledge and adventure were completely lost. Poetry became more satirical, realistic, and was written in the heroic couplet of which Dryden was the supreme master. The theatres which were shut by the Puritans opened again. The plays took a new form, which lacked emotional approach to life and poetry. Moreover, it appealed to the aristocratic class only. Prose reached a major mark in this age. 18th century literature. In literature, it is often referred to as the Classical Age. The 18th century English writers who attempted to emulate the straightforward and honorable practices of the great ancient authors came to be known as classical writers. The fantastical form of writing that was popular in earlier eras was resisted by English writers, who required that poetry, theatre, and prose adhere to strict norms. They are known as pseudo-classicists because they were only superficially similar to the old classical writers, lacking their sublimity, soul, and grandeur. The Romantic Age. The most productive era in the development of English literature is the Romantic Age. It is a movement that began in opposition to the neoclassical school of thought and was symbolized by the 1798 publication of Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads. The feelings and freedom of the artist were given top priority throughout the Romantic era. The essence of literature was that it had to mirror everything that was spontaneous and unaltered in both nature and man, and it had to be free to express itself any way it pleased. This epoch has generated more poets than any other in the history of English literature. Furthermore, it was a time of revolutionary transformation, not just in terms of how poetry was seen and used, but also in terms of how people thought about the nature of man and the world he lived in. This period produced many great poets, including the escapist Keats, the visionary Coleridge, and many more, including Wordsworth, Shelley, Byron, and Southey. The Victorian Age. The early Victorian Age and the late Victorian Age are the first two periods of the Victorian era, which began in 1832. It was a known fact that England was rapidly transitioning from agricultural to manufacturing, and that the middle class was gaining influence. Child labor was decried, and measures were tried to reduce it. The Victorian author Charles Dickens brought attention to this problem in his works. Because the authors and poets believed it was their responsibility to convert others to religion, their writing tended to be more moralistic in tone. The well-known poets of this era are Alfred Tennyson, Matthew Arnold, and Robert Browning. Victorian literature is often considered as stuffy and morally oppressive. However, it is also very imaginative and emotional. It also reflects realism to show the plight of everyday working class. Some of the most famous authors of this period are Charlotte Brontë, Emily Brontë, and Charles Dickens. During this time, novel writing became the most prominent literary work. The modern age. The so-called hypocritical attitude of the Victorian society was opposed by the modern age in English literature, which began at the turn of the 20th century. People searched for realism and the purpose of life because nothing was taken for granted. They questioned everything and did not take anything for granted. Modern poets have a lot of creative leeway when selecting their themes. The idea that a poet's sole responsibility was to produce beautiful has long since dissipated. They wrote about both lovely and sinister things, human emotions, depressing reality, world wars, pessimism, and humanitarianism. The new dramatists gave up the old style of their predecessors and began to portray the actual English life in their plays. The characters in their plays were often restless, questioning and dissatisfied. Some of the novels adopted the technique of stream of consciousness. All the past traditions and norms were broken, and the writers started to focus more on the characters' inner mind and psychology, rather than the actions and plot. Science made a massive progress, and Darwinism and other such theories, which challenged religious beliefs, greatly welcomed doubts and skepticism. Postmodernism. The various catastrophes that occurred in the latter half of the 20th century left a number of writers with a profound sense of paranoia, which for many postmodern writers served as a response to the alleged stylistic and ideological limitations of modernist literature and the radical changes the world underwent after the end of World War II. According to postmodern philosophy, it is useless and impossible to try to find any precise meaning to any idea, concept, or event because knowledge and facts are always tied to specific conditions. This idea had a significant impact on postmodern writers. Similar to this, the idea that the world has already ended and that true, unique meaning cannot be found lies at the heart of the imagination of many postmodern literary authors. It also indicates that literature should be used to illuminate the absurdities, contradictions, and ironies of the outside world. There are authors of postmodern literature from all around the world. It does not only apply to writers from one location or culture. Numerous authors and literary creations from throughout the globe are categorized by critics and academics as postmodern. We are still living in the postmodern era. Have you ever wondered what will come next?